Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? But with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers, a network of 130 million of them, in fact. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills, and did I say job title? See how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Gift magical mornings with Nespresso Virtuo Pop. Compact and stylish, Virtuo Pop is made to meet every morning coffee craving. From espresso to coffee, hot or iced, at the click of a button. And celebrate the season with Nespresso's limited edition coffee flavors. Sweet almond and hibiscus, cinnamon and candied tamarind, and festive double espresso. Magic in the making. Shop the holiday gift collection exclusively at Nespresso.com.
This episode is brought to you by Tic Tac. Your boss is going off at you for missing a deadline and you swear the clock just moved backwards. Suddenly, you remember the pack of Tic Tacs on your desk. Now you're riding horseback on the beach, the smell of citrus in the air. And what's this? Your boss is sitting behind you, breathing heavenly fresh mint? Refresh your mouth and mind and share your good vibes with Tic Tac.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of New Books Network. This is your host, Moteza Hajizadeh, and today I'm honored to be speaking with Professor Urmila Seshagiri about a recent book that she has published with Princeton University Press. And this is a surprise to a lot of literature lovers. The book we're going to discuss is called The Life of Violet, 3 Earliest Stories from Virginia Woolf. And Urmila has done the wonderful job of editing these stories. These are 3 unpublished stories from Virginia Woolf that have been published for the first time by Princeton University Press. And it's I'm so excited to talk to Urmila about this work. Professor Urmila Seshagiri is Professor of English at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. She's also the author of Race and the Modernist Imagination. She's the editor of Oxford World Classics edition of Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room and a contributor to Los Angeles Review of Books. Urmila, welcome to New Books Network.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we start talking about this book, and I must say it's going to be a difficult interview because we want to talk about the work of fiction without really spoiling the content. But we'll talk about it anyhow. Can you just very briefly introduce yourself? Tell us how you became interested in literature, and especially Virginia Woolf.
Thank you. I am, as you said in your very gracious introduction, a professor of English literature at the University of Tennessee. And I've always loved language. I've always loved literature. And I've always gravitated towards fiction. And I thought I was going to be a Shakespearean when I began graduate school. And then I took a seminar on modernism. And there was no turning me away from the modern novel at that point. And I actually came to Woolf in a very unusual way. I had read a couple of works in college. I read Mrs. Dalloway and I read A Room of One's Own. But when I got to graduate school, I met 2 people who wanted to make a play about Virginia Woolf's life as it was represented in her letters. So we formed a theater company and we wrote and assembled a play that told the story of her life with the language of her letters, from her very earliest letters to her very last ones. And we cast it and we performed it at the University of Illinois, where I was doing my graduate work. We were invited to the, which was then only the 4th Woolf International Virginia Woolf Conference. And then we had a 10-day run at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, which was fantastic. And doing that work with those actors and with my collaborators gave me an insight into Woolf's life and her writing. And when you do a play, you hear words over and over and over again in the course of rehearsals and performances. And so those words that she wrote about herself, about her life, about her art, just became part of my thinking and part of my brain. And then a few years later, when I began writing my dissertation, the first chapter that I wrote was the Woolf chapter. And I wrote about To the Lighthouse and Orlando. And then it was my very good fortune and now somewhat unreal privilege to secure a job at the University of Tennessee, and I've been here now since 2002.
Wonderful. I hope you don't hate me for saying that. I studied English literature myself. Virginia Woolf is, I don't know, when I was a student, she was never my favorite author. I guess for a reason that English was my second language. So I prefer to read the classics rather than the modernists. And I prefer to read something that was, linear with a middle, beginning, and end. So I found her text a bit difficult and challenging. So I think I started with To the Lighthouse. But after I graduated, actually, I became more fond of Virginia Woolf. Yeah. Anyhow,
I have met many people over the years who have that experience. And I think it's very hard to start with To the Lighthouse. I would not advise somebody who hasn't read Woolf to start with that. I think it can be very challenging, and it can just be confusing. What's happening here? Nothing's happening. I don't understand. But I think that if you have a teacher or a professor who can guide you through how to understand what she's trying to do, then there's a rhythm and there's a cadence and the poetry of what she's accomplishing with each sentence in each novel comes out. But I agree with you that she's not perhaps the easiest novelist to just open the book and fall in with.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it's important because like I told you, I studied English. My English was my second language, and I studied that in Iran. And we had a course, British novels, and there were two courses, British novel number 1 and then 2. So they had to jam 3 or 4 novels into their sample of English literature. And one of them was Virginia Woolf, To the Lighthouse. And I don't think it was the right decision at that time, but you're absolutely right. Because after I graduated, and it's okay, everybody's talking about this Woolf. Let me just get over my trauma maybe and start reading her. And I started to enjoy her even more then. Yeah. Let's talk about this book. I was amazed when I saw that the book is going to be published by Princeton. 3 stories from Virginia Woolf that has never been published before. It's the first time. I found it absolutely surprising. Tell us about this book. How did it come about? How did you discover these stories? And it's called The Life of Violet. What does that title refer to? There's a lot in there, I guess.
That was a lot of questions. So let me start by providing some background. And the first thing that I have to clarify is that I didn't discover a new book by Virginia Woolf that nobody had ever heard of before. What I discovered was a revision, a finished, professionally typed version of 3 early stories, as the title tells us, that scholars have known about only in rough draft form. So the New York Public Library acquired a massive collection of Woolf's papers. And among them is an item that is called Friendship's Gallery. And it's typed in violet ink. The typewriter ribbon was violet colored. And it's 3 stories. One is called Friendship's Gallery, one is called The Magic Garden, and one is called A Story to Make You Sleep. And scholars have known that these were works that Woolf composed in 1907 when she was 25 years old. And they were written as a kind of inside joke for her friend Violet Dickinson. And I'll talk a little bit more about Violet later. And the typescript that's in the New York Public Library is not very polished. It's readable, but there are parts of it where you can see Woolf doesn't really know how she wants to end a sentence or format a paragraph, or she's got a few different possibilities on the page, and she's gone back and she's done handwritten edits over the typing, and it's very much a draft in process. Those 3 stories were only published once in 1979 in an academic journal called 20th Century Literature. And transcribing them was the work of a scholar named Ellen Hawkes. And the transcription that was published is necessarily approximate because it's very hard to know how to transcribe a rough draft. How do you put in all the possibilities of, well, it could have been this word, it could have been this word, this was crossed out. I don't know if she wanted the first word, the word above it, the word below it. How do you do that? And Hawkes's transcription was then reproduced in volume 6 of Virginia Woolf's collected essays. And it was put in, these 3 stories were put in an appendix of unfinished essays or unpublished essays. They weren't even categorized as stories. And that was in 1979. That was a really long time ago. And these 3 stories that are known collectively under the title Friendship's Gallery, even though that wasn't Woolf's title, and that's only the title of the first story, have never been printed in a collection of Virginia Woolf's fiction. They're not in the complete shorter fiction. They're not in more recent collections of Woolf's fiction that have been produced by Penguin or by Vintage or by any other, an academic publisher. They've just been shunted to the wayside because they are so approximate, so rough, so young. In 1907, Woolf has not begun publishing fiction. So fast forward to 2018, and this is where I enter the story. I was at the University of Sussex conducting research for my scholarly edition of Woolf's autobiography, which is called A Sketch of the Past. And she was writing her memoir, this autobiography, when she died. And so at the time of her death, it was unpublished and it was unfinished and unpublished. And Woolf, of course, famously wrote 2 suicide notes. One of them said to her husband, Leonard, will you please destroy all my papers? The other one didn't say that, and Leonard didn't destroy her papers. And I was researching this memoir, which was only published in 1976 and has never been published in a formal scholarly edition. And so it's a sort of very monumental undertaking that I had set for myself. It's my Everest project, if you will. And I came across a reference in my research for this edition of this autobiography to something that Woolf wanted from her friend Violet Dickinson. And I asked the archivists in the Sussex Library, do you have this item by Violet? And they said, no, but you might reach out to Longleat House in Wiltshire. Now, I had never heard of Longleat House. And I sent them an email, and they said, yes, we have this item by Violet Dickinson because we have her papers here, and we assume you'll also be interested in Virginia Woolf's Friendship's Gallery. Now, I immediately wrote and said, oh, you must have a copy of what's in the New York Public Library. I've seen that. I don't need to see it. And they wrote back and said, no, we have an original work by Virginia Woolf called Friendship's Gallery. We've never heard of this New York Public Library item that you're talking about, but we have an original Virginia Woolf work here. I didn't know what to think. So I contacted the archivist in the New York Public Library, Carolyn Vega, who oversees the Berg collection where Woolf's papers are. And she had never heard of the Longleat item. And we wanted to see this item right away because, of course, what is it? But there are very strict estate rules governing how documents at Longleat can be accessed. Violet Dickinson's papers are still under copyright. And this item, this mysterious new Friendships Gallery, could not be scanned, Xeroxed, photographed, shown during a Zoom or a FaceTime session. And so there was a long, complicated process that I will skip over. And just when it seemed feasible in March of 2020 that I was going to be able to go to Wiltshire and visit Longleat House, the pandemic happened. And during the pandemic, I was unable to send, obviously, I could not go myself, and I couldn't hire a research assistant in the UK to go to Longleat House and study this item for me because Longleat then closed to researchers. They closed to the public. And so it was not until 2022 that I made my way to Longleat House after the pandemic, and with the generosity and the guidance of the Longleat archivist, Emma Challoner, went into this mansion that is like something from a movie this enormous mansion outside of Bath, manor house, and walked up a staircase with portraits and carved wooden balusters on either side, and she led me into a reading room and handed me a box. And I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know if this was going to be a huge disappointment. I didn't know if it was going to be identical to the work that was in the New York Public Library. I didn't know if it was going to have new chapters that were unknown to readers. So I lifted the lid, and there was this saffron-bound book that said Friendships Gallery on the cover. And I opened it, and I started reading it. And it was an unforgettable moment for me because I could see immediately from the first page that Woolf had revised the work and that it was different, it was better, it was more sophisticated, it was more polished. And at the same time, it was the same work. It was almost like seeing a child grown up, so that you could recognize the child that once was when it was younger, but now the child has grown and is bigger and is more self-sufficient, if you will. And I don't want to push that metaphor too far, but it was as thrilling for being recognizable as it was for being new. And I sat down in a chair and I just reread and read for the first time these 3 stories. And I was so enchanted and captivated and stunned that there was this item that had her handwriting on it, that had her revisions that were unknown. So that's the very long story of how that discovery came to be.
It's fascinating, and I really love the way you depicted, the moment you walk into the manor. I can only imagine the suspense. Wow. And you mentioned Virginia Woolf's friend. What was her influence on Woolf? She was more than a friend, of course. Was she like a literary sounding board to Woolf?
Violet Dickinson was 17 years older than Virginia Woolf. They met when Woolf was 20 and Violet was 37. And Violet was born into a wealthy family in Somerset. And she was 6 feet 2 inches tall. She was born in 1865. And I cannot imagine all the things that meant for her. To be a woman, a quote, well-born woman, a wealthy woman, and to be 6'2". It is a state of exile. It is potentially a dead end. You're unmarriageable. What are you going to do? You don't belong to a professional class. You don't belong to a working class. You're not, at this moment in history, it's not possible to go off to college. She's not going to leave home and become let's say a governess or a showgirl or something. There aren't a lot of opportunities for her. So she lived a very courageous, very interesting life. She had tons of friends, tons and tons of friends. And among them were the daughters of Leslie Stephen and Julia Stephen. So Stella Duckworth, who was Virginia Woolf's older half-sister, was friends with Violet. And that's how Woolf met Violet. And Stella, her older sister, died. Woolf's mother died when Woolf was 13 in 1895, suddenly, out of the blue. Very traumatic. 8 children at home. And her mother just died of perhaps traumatic fever. We don't really know how she died. And then Stella Duckworth, who was the oldest daughter, Julia's the mother's daughter from her first marriage, stepped into the role of being the maternal figure in the lives of the children. She got married in 1897, and she was suddenly stricken with illness, perhaps appendicitis, perhaps peritonitis, we don't know, and she died. And so these two deaths were immensely traumatic for Woolf. And it was in the 7 years between Stella's death and Woolf's father's death in 1904 that her friendship with Violet was central to her life. They were friends, they socialized together, they were prolific correspondents. And if you ever have a chance to look at the first volume of the 6 volumes of Woolf's published letters, more than half of them are letters that she wrote to Violet. It seems when you read them that there wasn't a thought or a feeling she had or an experience that she underwent that she did not record and immediately transmit to Violet. So Violet has been regarded as a kind of surrogate mother, older sister, a kind of aunt. In fact, Woolf's nickname for her was Aunt Maria. And she was very funny. She had a tremendous sense of humor. And these letters are very often very funny that she sends to Violet. So Woolf, in these years, is living a life that she describes in her memoir as the division in our lives was very curious. Upstairs, where she and her sister Vanessa had their bedroom where she would write and Vanessa would paint. She would say upstairs was pure intellect, downstairs was nothing but convention. And that's where her father and her half-brothers would come and expect to be served tea and to entertain guests and to have all of the protocols of, coming down dressed for dinner, observed all the way through 1904 when Leslie Stephen died of cancer. So she was leading a life that felt split in two halves, where there was the artistic, creative, intellectual side of her that was desperate to thrive and to create and to grow. And then there was her social persona, which her half-brothers were insisting be channeled into a marriage market. And she didn't want to be, presented at parties and at balls and be introduced to wealthy young aristocratic men, the sons of well-placed politicians or statesmen or landowners. She just wanted to read and to write and to be with people who are intelligent like herself. And it's during this period that she begins to send her writings to Violet. And Violet is an emotional support. That's how she's been known all along. The role that Violet plays in biographies of Woolf is this intense, intimate companion who takes care of her when she has her first breakdown. She writes to her, mothers her, gives her wise counsel. But she also recognized Woolf's immense talent as a writer. And in 1904, she introduced Woolf to an editor at The Guardian, not the Guardian newspaper we read today, but a clerical newspaper, and said, you should start writing essays and reviews for this paper. And so it was Violet who facilitated Woolf's first paid appearance in print and launched her career. And we owe Violet a great deal for that, because it's that first step that paved the way for subsequent writings. So in 1905, Violet and her friends, Lord Robert and Lady Nellie Cecil, went on a huge, several months long round-the-world cruise, starting from England and going to Canada and then to Japan, many, many cities in Japan, and then Hong Kong, China and Singapore, and then down to Sri Lanka, and then up to Egypt and to all the Cairo, to Aden, and then back up to Italy. And Violet wrote to Woolf during this trip. And she wrote her postcards and letters, and none of these, unfortunately, survive, but we can infer their content from Woolf's letters back to Violet, all of which survive. And Woolf was really tickled by this trip. It really seized her imagination. And so in 1907, she said, I'm going to write a life of Violet. I'm going to write something about the aesthetic sense in Nellie and Violet. And then in August of 1907, she sends these 3 stories, to Violet Dickinson to read. And everybody thought that was it, that she had written these stories for Violet to mock their mutual friends and their aristocratic conventionality, their traditions, their superficiality, and then to make a fantasy out of the round the world trip focusing on the Japan portion. And nobody knew that Woolf took the time to revise these stories and to perfect them. And that's in itself, that knowledge is so fascinating because it shows us the care she brought to her literary writing at a time when we really think that she's putting most of her effort into publishing short essays for The Guardian, for the TLS, and thinking about the novel she wants to write. She's spends many years working on The Voyage Out, her first novel, which she publishes in 1915. But we're not used to thinking of her as a writer of short stories in 1907, 1908. And then to have the work professionally typed, and then to take that professional typescript and continue working on it, because the long lead typescript that I discovered has further hand edits. So she was still working on it. She always did that. Nothing was ever finished for her all the way through to her last novels. Nothing was ever finished. She was always revising. And so it's very lovely to find an early work that gives us that same evidence.
And Violet herself was also involved in, was she involved in like providing maybe annotations to the final version?
So Woolf sent the stories to Violet, and Violet's handwriting is on the New York Public Library typescript, which is the draft. And you see that she's crossed out a word here and there and replaced it with her own. There are places where Woolf has tactfully not filled in the names of characters like Lady Blank or Lord Blank, and Violet has gone in and put those names in her handwriting to say, no, we're going to identify Kitty Max and Nellie and Hatfield House and 29 Fitzroy Square, all things that Woolf had tactfully disguised and anonymized for purposes of the story. So when Woolf had the draft stories, when she revised them and had them typed, she incorporated some of Violet's suggestions. And that too is a small but significant detail, because we don't have a lot of evidence later of any kind of collaborative writing like that, someone else's hand on the typescript that Woolf then respects enough to say, yeah, I'm going to take your word or your punctuation or your name for another character. And that, I think that's a nice detail about this discovery.
As a contractor, I don't pay for materials I don't use. So why would I pay for stuff I don't need in my mobile plan? That's why my Biz plan from Verizon Business is so perfect. Now I can choose exactly what I want, and I only pay for what I need.
Right now, with my Biz plan, get our best price, as low as $25 a line. Visit Verizon.com/business to get started today. New lines only. Price per month with 5+ lines. Includes auto pay and paper-free billing and promotional discount. Taxes, fees, economic adjustment charge. Applicable add-ons, prices, and terms apply. Guarantee applies to base monthly rate and stated discounts only. Add-on prices additional. Offers in January 5th, 2026.
When cool, creamy ranch meets tangy, bold buffalo, the whole is greater than the sum of its sauce. Say howdy, partner, to new Buffalo Ranch sauce. Only at McDonald's for a limited time.
At participating McDonald's.
The all-new 2026 Hyundai Palisade Hybrid doesn't just turn heads. It commands respect. With its stunning exterior, luxurious interior with available captain seats, and spacious third-row seating and equipped with advanced technology, you and the family are making a statement before you even step out. Okay, Hyundai. Visit HyundaiUSA.com to learn more and experience the all-new 2026 Palisade Hybrid today.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to tell you that Michelob Ultra, the official beer partner of the NBA, is bringing NBA fans closer than ever this season with chances to win great prizes, including courtside tickets. Enter now at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Courtside 25 to 26, No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 plus. Begins on October 1st, 2025 and ends on June 30th, 2026. Multiple entry periods. See official rules at michelobultra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, prizes, and details.
And I know that literary scholars hate this question of categorizing, but these three stories, it's not really a biography, it's mock-biography. And you describe it also as a feminist act. Can you talk about the genre, or how Virginia Woolf played with the genre, and how does it help us to see this as a feminist act, and how does it challenge these traditional biographical narratives?
Yeah, and I love that question, and Woolf loved that question, because genre is so important, and Woolf knew that the only way to retain the vitality of literary genres was to keep challenging them and remaking them. And most famously, of course, we know she attacks Arnold Bennett, along with John Galsworthy and H.G. Wells, for being what she calls materialists, these Edwardian writers in the first decade of the 20th century who immured their works, who draped their characters and their houses and settings and folds so lifelike that they seemed as though the novel was done to a turn. But she always felt they're missing that essential spirit of fiction. And she rejected the idea of progress in fiction, that what was written 10 years ago was not as good as what is written now. She says fiction is not like a motor car, right? The motor car we have today is going to be an improvement on the one we had earlier. But fiction is not like that. We move a little this way, a little that way, she says. And so genre is where these movements happen. And she famously, every time she writes a novel, thinks about how she's going to remake her storytelling this time. And so with The Life of Violet, she calls it, she says, she refers to it as my life of you. She calls it the myth. She calls it the life. She refers to herself as a mythobiographer. And she loves biography. She loves life writing. She always does. She is a novelist whose abiding passion was biography. And if you read her diaries, if you read her letters, if you read her reading notebooks, Woolf was always reading biographies and autobiographies. She was reviewing them for magazines and for newspapers. She herself was writing a number of biographies of real people, of invented people, obscure, famous, dead, living. One work that has been lost that I wish would turn up magically is a comic biography of her aunt, Caroline Amelia Stephen, who was very religious. They referred to her as the nun, and they couldn't stand her piousness and her zeal for religious devotion, and so she wrote a mock biography of her that Violet thought was hilarious, and she loved it. And she told Woolf's sister that Woolf was a genius. And so the writing of lives is something that had always, at this point, she was 25 years old, and she would be consistently interested in the act of writing a life, whether it was hers or someone else's. So what does that mean for these three stories? This is a mock biography because it is full of fantasy and things that are impossible. First of all, it is a work that has elements of fairy tales, of fantastical, otherworldly creatures and happenings. It's a mock biography because it mocks the idea of biography. The narrator of these stories is a male biographer. A historian. He insists he's not a novelist. He's very nervous. He doesn't want to get things wrong. He continually says, trust me, I'm telling you this correctly. I'm being very sincere. I don't have time to tell you this, but trust me that what I'm leaving out is not important. Or even though I didn't explain this to you, I know that it's true. He repeatedly gets into an obsessive state about the truth of the life he describes to us. And although the form of these biographies is not as radical as the work that we read of Woolf and think about as experimental 2 decades later. It is concerned with those experimental possibilities. And Violet herself is the inspiration for that. And that's where the multi-dimensional feminist elements of the work arise. Feminism is both its spirit, its aesthetic, as well as the motor of its plot. In the sense that Violet is a child who grows and grows and grows. And on the first page, the nurse, the doctor says to the nurse, fetch the weighing scale when the child is born. And the nurse says, it's the foot rule you want, sir. How do we measure this child? How do we measure a girl who is big, who is long, who is tall, whose proportions don't fit into the expectations of the proportions for a girl? And what does that mean for everything that she is supposed to do? So in the first story, Friendship's Gallery, and I won't spoil anything here, but Violet does go through the motions. Woolf has her going through the motions. She is a child who doesn't want to obey her parents. She doesn't want to learn the lessons that a sequence of governesses come in to teach her. She goes to a ball, but nothing conventionally exciting happens at the ball. And then the story takes a turn, and nothing that you would expect as the outcome from those things takes place. Woolf writes a different story for this character. Similarly, in The Magic Garden, which is the second story, we've got Violet, now grown up, who is bored with her rich, titled, propertied friends. And who's the hero of that story? It's the gardener of the manor. And the gardener, who is ruddy and bent and smelly and doesn't have good manners, but speaks about the earth and the land to her in a way that sparks her passions and strengthens her resolve to build a cottage of her own. And here's the origin of that phrase. This is a really wonderful moment in these stories where we can see the Woolf we know later, who writes a room of one's own. Well, this is the first time she tries out that phrase. A cottage of one's own is in this book that is now published. And Violet Dickinson in real life did build a cottage, called it Burnham Wood, and welcomed people from all kinds of places and backgrounds into that cottage. And Violet, the character, does the same thing. And then the third story, which is called A Story to Make You Sleep, is an absolute fantasy that is set in Tokyo. And Violet and Nellie Cecil become giantesses and goddesses and princesses. And they go to Tokyo and they do all manner of fanciful, delightful, silly, comical things. And so there is tremendous feminist energy in each of these stories and in the male narrator's mystification about how he can accurately tell the story when none of the forms of storytelling he has can contain Violet, can contain her impulses and her actions and her desires.
It is, and when I was reading these stories, I really love those kind of, fantastical elements that orient. There's some oriental imagery in this as well. Is there a continuity between these two stories and the future and the later works of Virginia Woolf, such as Orlando? Is there a thread that you see running through early pieces to her more mature fiction?
Yeah, there are many hints of the Woolf to come. So, saying the phrase, a cottage of one's own, obviously paves the way to a room of one's own. And Orlando, of course, which is her most magical, impossible, charming novel, where a boy in Elizabethan England turns into a woman, lives for hundreds of years. And that's a novel that is also about women owning property and inspired by a woman friend, inspired by Vita Sackville-West. We see Woolf's emphasis on what a society of women can achieve. What can women together do? And we have a much more sophisticated, philosophical or intellectual approach to that question in Three Guineas, of course in Urmila Bonzone, but also in Three Guineas. But here we have it within the plot, and we see these women who are larger than life coming together and laughing and breaking rules, and not doing it with anger, not doing it in the spirit of some kind of social rebellion, not doing it they're just being natural, they're being themselves, and Woolf architects the story in such a way to give that naturalness a lot of oxygen. So yes, we see hints of the wolf to come, but we also see this uniquely fantastical impulse in her right now that we don't get later. We don't have dragons in Woolf, later. Silver sea monsters and sugared almonds falling from trees and so on.
And one final question, and I guess this is also related to feminism and women authors as well. It's the power of the transformative power of friendship, women's friendship, both in life and literature. There are some examples of that in literature as well. But I'm keen to know how this work, Life of Violet, what does it teach us about that? Let's say that power of friendship between women, both in their personal life and also in their creative life.
We could say that at the most literal level, that the friendship between Woolf and Violet inspires the stories. But from a literary point of view, friendship between women opens up imaginative possibilities. There are no constraints imposed by patriarchal expectations of female characters in these stories. So the marriage plot vanishes. It's not that it's there and has to be resisted. It's just not there. Woolf imagines other possibilities. So that the magic garden, you have people coming together in Violet's cottage and happily sitting on the lawn and digging. And these are people who are nurses. These are wealthy women. These are Coptic scholars. These are all kinds of people. And that mixing of social classes, that free interchange of ideas between men and women, between generations, there are visions of different types of utopias in these stories that come into being when women's friendships with one another get to drive the plot rather than the presence or absence of women's relationships to men.
I know that you've recently edited this book and it's been published with Princeton Press. I'm wondering if you're a famous Virginia Woolf scholar. I'm wondering if there's any other project, book project or anything else that you're working on sometime we might expect soon.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I am bringing out the first scholarly edition of Woolf's autobiography, A Sketch of the Past. And hopefully that will be published within the year. And Cornell University Press is set to publish that. And I'm working on an edition of To the Lighthouse for that novel's 100th year anniversary. So the centenary of To the Lighthouse is 2027. And I'm producing a new edition of that for Norton, for W.W. Norton and Company. And I'm also writing a scholarly monograph about legacies of modernism in contemporary culture. So that's a more long-term project. I'm not sure when that'll be done. But
well, that's a lot of work. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to that 100-year day, the centenary edition. I've got a couple of those books. I've got Ulysses here, which is the one, and I've got a Great Gatsby, which was also published by Cambridge.
Yes,
really looking forward to that. And hopefully, I didn't get the chance to talk to the editor of these two books, but hopefully, it's 2 years away, but hopefully I can secure the promise to talk to you about these books on New Books Network.
It would be my absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I strongly recommend this book to our listeners, The Life of Violet, three early stories from Virginia Woolf. The stories were just fantastic, and I also really loved the introduction you had in the book and all the exploration, how you came across the manuscript. It was just wonderful. I guess you have a great, let's say, story writing skills as well. When I was reading, I didn't really feel like I'm reading a scholarly introduction to a book. So really enjoyed reading that as well. Thank you very much, Urmila, for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you.
Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan are back in Disney's Freakier Friday, now streaming on Disney+.
We switched bodies.
I am freaking out right now. I think I just peed a little.
It's an absolute riot. And the only movie that can be described as
so much weirder than the last time. What last time?
It's the frequel.
You ready?
We've been waiting for.
That absolutely slays.
Disney's Freakier Friday, now streaming on Disney+. Rated PG.